Before we dive into this thrilling story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful tale. Now, picture this. A lively Mardi Gras parade filled with joy and celebration is suddenly disrupted by unexpected troublemakers. But the locals are far from ordinary. They're about to show what resilience truly looks like. Let's get into it. The vibrant streets of New Orleans were alive with color and music. Floats adorned with glittering beads rolled down Bourbon Street, their dazzling lights reflecting off the excited faces of the crowd. The air was thick with the scent of fried food, sweet king cake, and the unmistakable energy of Mardi Gras. Marie LeBlanc, a lifelong resident and parade organizer, stood near the center of the commotion. Dressed in a sequined jacket and a feathered mask, she surveyed the celebration with pride. This year's parade was one of the largest the town had seen in years, a testament to the community's resilience after a string of recent hurricanes. Children laughed as they scrambled for beads thrown from the floats, while adults clinked glasses of hand grenades and hurricanes, toasting to the joy of the season. Marie's heart swelled as she watched the scene unfold. This was more than a parade. It was a celebration of their identity, their culture, their spirit. But just as the parade reached its peak, a shift in the atmosphere sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. It started subtly. A group of motorcycles revving their engines louder than necessary at the edge of the parade route. The riders, dressed in dark leather with matching jackets emblazoned with the name Iron Shadows, exuded an air of arrogance as they pushed their way through the crowd. Marie's eyes narrowed as she noticed them. They weren't locals. She knew almost everyone in the neighborhood, and these men stood out like a sore thumb. They were trouble, and she could feel it in her gut. As the motorcycles pushed further into the parade, the riders began causing disruptions. One reached out and grabbed a string of beads from a vendor's booth, tossing it to the ground with a laugh. Another revved his engine so loudly that it startled a child, making him cry. The joyful cheers of the crowd started to falter, replaced by murmurs of confusion and concern. Marie pushed her way through the throng, her jaw tightening with each act of disrespect she witnessed. "Who are these guys?" a man next to her muttered, his expression mirroring her own. "I don't know," Marie said, her voice steady but firm. "But they're not here to celebrate." As the disruption grew, one of the bikers climbed onto the hood of a parked car, raising his arms as if to claim victory over the parade. "This is our street now," he shouted, his voice echoing over the stunned silence of the crowd. Marie clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She had spent months organizing this parade, working tirelessly to bring joy to her community. She wasn't about to let a group of outsiders ruin it. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Hey, get down from there." The biker turned to her, his smirk wide and mocking. "Or what?" he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. Marie didn't flinch. "You're not from here, so let me give you some advice. We don't take kindly to people disrespecting our traditions." The man laughed, clearly unbothered by her warning. But Marie wasn't alone. A few locals began stepping forward, their expressions hardening as they realized what was happening. "This is our home," one of them said firmly, a tall man with the build of a former football player. "You don't mess with Mardi Gras." The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly as the crowd began to shift. What had once been a sea of passive onlookers was now a wall of determined locals, their unity unshakable. Marie's voice rose again, calm but commanding. "Leave. Now." For a moment, the bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering under the weight of the crowd's collective resolve. But their leader, the man on the car, wasn't ready to back down. "You think you can scare us?" he said, jumping down and gesturing to his crew. "Let's show them what happens when you mess with us." Marie's heart pounded as the tension reached a boiling point. The joy of the parade had been replaced with a simmering anger. The crowd's energy now focused on protecting their home and their traditions. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting those of her neighbors. Together, they were stronger than any outsider could ever understand. This wasn't just a parade anymore. It was a fight for their community, and Marie knew they weren't going to lose. The tension was thick in the air as the bikers revved their engines, their mocking laughter cutting through the uneasy murmurs of the crowd. The Mardi Gras parade, once a celebration of unity and joy, now felt like a battleground. Marie stood at the front of the gathering crowd, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. This wasn't just a personal affront. It was an attack on their community, their identity, their heritage, and Marie wasn't about to let them get away with it. "You've got one last chance to leave," Marie called out, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. "Take your bikes and go, or we'll make you regret staying." Her words carried a weight that even the bikers couldn't ignore. The leader, the man who had jumped down from the car hood, paused for a moment, his smirk faltering as he looked at her. "You really think you can take us?" he sneered, gesturing to his crew. "We outnumber you." Marie's lips tightened into a thin line. "Maybe, but you don't outnumber all of us." She motioned subtly to the growing crowd behind her. Locals were stepping forward, abandoning their beads and drinks to join her. The football player from earlier stood at her side, his arms crossed as he stared down the bikers. Beside him, an older woman with gray hair and sharp eyes clutched a broom handle like a weapon, her expression daring anyone to challenge her. "New Orleans doesn't back down," the football player said, his voice booming over the quiet. "You picked the wrong place to make trouble." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado slipping as they realized they were no longer dealing with a few scattered onlookers. The crowd had transformed into a united front, their collective determination palpable, but the leader wasn't ready to admit defeat. "All right," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You want us gone? Make us leave." With that, he lunged forward, grabbing a string of beads from a vendor's stall and throwing them at Marie's feet. His crew erupted into laughter, their engines roaring as if to punctuate his challenge. Marie didn't flinch. She bent down, picked up the beads, and handed them back to the vendor. Then she turned to face the bikers again, her gaze steady and unyielding. "You want to fight?" she said calmly. "Then you've got one." The locals surged forward, their unity overpowering any fear they might have felt. A man from a nearby float stepped down, his face painted in bright Mardi Gras colors, holding a wooden plank he'd pulled from the float's base. A group of teenagers, still wearing their parade costumes, formed a line, their expressions fierce. One of the bikers revved his engine and tried to push his motorcycle through the crowd, but he was quickly stopped by a group of men who grabbed the handlebars and tipped the bike onto its side. The biker stumbled, his curses drowned out by the crowd's cheers. The older woman with the broom handle jabbed it toward another biker who had stepped forward, her movements swift and deliberate. "You think you can come into our city and scare us?" she snapped. "Think again." The bikers were clearly caught off guard. They had expected the locals to scatter, to cower in fear. Instead, they were met with a wall of resistance, every face in the crowd radiating the same unshakable resolve. Marie watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with pride. These weren't just neighbors. They were family, bound together by a shared love for their city and its traditions. She turned to the football player beside her. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jerome," he replied, his gaze fixed on the bikers. "Jerome," she said. "Let's make sure they don't forget this night." Jerome nodded, stepping forward with a commanding presence. He grabbed a trash can lid from the side of the street, using it as a makeshift shield as he advanced on the leader of the bikers. The leader raised his fists, clearly ready for a fight. But Jerome didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he knocked the man off balance, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy fueling the locals as they pushed the bikers back. One by one, the bikers began to retreat, their confidence shattered. Snake Tattoo, one of the more aggressive members of the gang, tried to rally his crew, but it was no use. The locals were too many, too united. "Let's get out of here," one of the bikers shouted, panic in his voice. The leader hesitated, his pride clearly wounded. But as Jerome stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over the man, the leader finally relented. "Fine," he spat, motioning for his crew to retreat. "But this isn't over." The bikers scrambled to their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life as they sped off into the night. As the last of them disappeared, the crowd erupted into applause and laughter. The tension evaporated, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie. People hugged, clapped each other on the back, and returned to their floats and booths, reclaiming the joy of Mardi Gras. Marie turned to Jerome, a smile breaking across her face. "We did it," he grinned. "They underestimated us. Big mistake." Marie took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the vibrant streets. The parade was a little bruised, but far from broken. This was New Orleans, after all, a city that knew how to bounce back. The celebration wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The roar of motorcycles filled the night air as the iron shadows sped away from the chaos they had ignited on Bourbon Street. The leader, Victor Viper Montague, clenched his jaw as he led the gang to the outskirts of the city. He didn't care about the mocking cheers of the locals that had chased them off, nor the embarrassment of retreating. What burned in his chest wasn't just rage, it was humiliation. The people of New Orleans had made fools of them, and he wasn't about to let that go unanswered. Their destination was a scrapyard just beyond the city limits, a place the Iron Shadows used as a hideout and headquarters. Twisted piles of metal and rusting cars created a maze of shadows and sharp edges, a perfect reflection of the gang's own gritty nature. As the bikers rolled to a stop, the tension among them was palpable. The echoes of their engines faded, leaving only the sound of boots crunching on gravel and low, frustrated muttering. Snake Tattoo, one of Viper's closest lieutenants, threw his helmet to the ground with a loud curse. "They made us look weak," he snarled, his hands balling into fists. "A bunch of nobodies with brooms and trash lids. We're the Iron Shadows, for crying out loud." Another biker, Rocco, leaned against his motorcycle, his thin frame trembling with anger. "We should have smashed that parade to pieces. Instead, we're the ones running like cowards." His voice was laced with shame, and the others nodded in bitter agreement. Viper remained silent, his icy gaze fixed on the horizon. He let the anger of his crew simmer, feeding their resentment without saying a word. Finally, he turned to face them, his scarred face illuminated by the dim floodlights of the scrapyard. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Enough." The gang fell silent, their eyes locked on their leader. Viper's presence alone commanded respect, but tonight, even he felt the sting of their failure. "You think I don't know how bad this looks?" he growled, his tone low and menacing. "They humiliated us, made us look like fools, but this isn't over." Snake Tattoo stepped forward, his anger now tempered by curiosity. "What's the plan, boss?" Viper's lips curled into a cold smirk. "We're going to remind them who we are. They think they've won because they chased us off with their Mardi Gras nonsense? Fine. We'll show them what happens when you mess with the Iron Shadows." The gang leaned in, their anticipation growing as Viper outlined his plan. It was simple but brutal. They would strike back at the heart of the celebration, targeting the floats and stands that symbolized the community's pride. If the locals wanted a fight, the Iron Shadows would bring it to them on their own terms. "Rocco," Viper said, turning to the wiry biker, "get the fireworks we've been holding on to, and make sure they're ready to cause some real damage." Snake Tattoo grinned, his earlier frustration replaced with excitement. "This is gonna be good." Viper nodded, his voice steady and filled with dark confidence. "We'll hit them hard and fast. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." As the bikers prepared for their next move, the scrapyard buzzed with activity. Engines roared to life, weapons were checked, and Viper's smirk widened as he imagined the chaos they were about to unleash. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about reclaiming their reputation. Meanwhile, back in the heart of New Orleans, the locals were still celebrating their victory. The streets of Bourbon Street were alive with music and laughter once again, though the earlier confrontation lingered in the minds of many. Marie stood near the main stage, watching as the floats rolled on and children danced in the glow of colorful lights. Her heart swelled with pride at what they had accomplished, but a lingering unease gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Jerome approached her, his towering frame a reassuring presence. "You should be smiling," he said, handing her a drink. "We sent them packing." Marie managed a small smile but shook her head. "For now. But they're not the kind to walk away quietly. This isn't over." Jerome's expression hardened. "You think they'll come back?" Marie nodded. "I'd bet on it, and when they do, we need to be ready." The determination in her voice resonated with Jerome. "I've got some friends who can help. Teammates from my football days. They've still got some fight left in them." Marie smiled, the faintest hint of hope returning to her. Good, because I think we're going to need all the help we can get. As the night deepened, the people of New Orleans unknowingly braced for what was to come. The Iron Shadows were preparing to strike again, and this time they weren't planning to leave quietly. But if there was one thing Marie and her community had proven, it was that New Orleans didn't back down from a fight. The spirit of the city was as unyielding as the Mississippi, and no gang, no matter how fearsome, could take that away. The stillness of the New Orleans night was broken by the low growl of motorcycles, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. The Iron Shadows were on the move, their headlights slicing through the darkness as they made their way back toward the heart of the Mardi Gras celebration. This time, there was no pretense of intimidation or casual disruption. Viper had made his intentions clear. This would be an attack designed to humiliate and dismantle the locals' spirit. At the head of the pack, Viper's sharp eyes scanned the horizon. His crew followed closely behind, each man carrying an unshakable determination to make the people of New Orleans regret ever standing up to them. The fireworks, repurposed into improvised explosives, were loaded into saddlebags and crates strapped to the back of their motorcycles. The plan was to unleash chaos, targeting the parade floats, food stands, and anything else that symbolized the locals' pride. Viper's mind burned with the image of the crowd scattering in fear. Their joy turned to ashes. It was all he wanted now. Revenge. Back on Bourbon Street, the parade was winding through the night with renewed energy. The music from brass bands filled the air, a steady rhythm of resilience and celebration. Floats adorned with glittering lights and intricate designs moved slowly through the streets, throwing beads and trinkets into the eager hands of the crowd. Marie stood near the main stage, her watchful eyes scanning the sea of people. The earlier confrontation with the bikers still lingered in her thoughts, a knot of unease twisting in her stomach. Jerome joined her, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the colorful lights of the parade. He carried a folding chair in one hand and a flashlight in the other, looking every bit like a man ready for whatever came next. "Still worried?" he asked, his deep voice steady. Marie nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They're coming back. I can feel it." Jerome didn't argue. Instead, he placed the chair down beside her and leaned on it, scanning the crowd just as she was. "We've got people ready," he said. "If they try anything, they won't get far." Marie glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Let's hope you're right." The first sign of trouble came as the parade turned onto a narrower street lined with food stands and small vendors. A series of loud cracks split the air, and for a brief moment, the crowd cheered, mistaking the sound for celebratory fireworks. But when sparks rained down near a float, igniting a pile of discarded beads, the cheers turned to shouts of confusion. Then the motorcycles arrived. The Iron Shadows roared into the street, their engines drowning out the music and laughter. Viper led the charge, his bike weaving dangerously close to the floats. Snake Tattoo followed, a smug grin on his face as he tossed a firework into a food stand. It exploded with a sharp pop, sending hot sparks flying and scattering the crowd. Vendors shouted in alarm, rushing to douse the flames with buckets of water. Marie's heart leapt as she saw the chaos unfolding. Grabbing the megaphone from a nearby table, she climbed onto the stage and shouted into the microphone, "Stay calm, stick together, protect the floats." Her voice carried through the street, cutting through the rising panic. The locals, many of whom had anticipated a second attack, sprang into action. Jerome and his former teammates formed a defensive line around the main floats, their broad shoulders and steely gazes enough to give some of the bikers pause. Behind them, a group of younger men and women armed themselves with anything they could find: broom handles, metal poles, even folding chairs. Viper slowed his bike, watching the locals regroup with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. He hadn't expected them to recover so quickly, and the sight of their defiance only fueled his anger. Revving his engine, he barked orders to his crew. "Hit them harder, show no mercy." Snake Tattoo rode straight toward the defensive line, his bike kicking up dust as he accelerated. But Jerome stepped forward, planting his feet firmly in the middle of the street. When Snake Tattoo was just feet away, Jerome swung a folding chair with the precision of a linebacker making a tackle. The chair collided with the front of the bike, sending snake tattoos sprawling onto the pavement. The crowd erupted into cheers as Jerome grabbed the downed biker by his collar and hauled him to his feet. Not tonight, Jerome growled, shoving Snake Tattoo toward the retreating motorcycles. Viper snarled, his frustration boiling over. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a large firework, lighting the fuse and tossing it toward a cluster of locals. But before it could detonate, an older man with a bullhorn, the same one who had rallied the crowd earlier, sprinted forward and kicked it away, sending the firework harmlessly into a puddle of water. The man raised the bullhorn to his lips and blasted a sharp, piercing sound toward Viper, forcing the leader to cover his ears. The tide of the battle began to turn. The locals pushed back against the bikers with a ferocity that surprised even Marie. The shopkeepers and performers who had been so vulnerable hours ago now stood tall, their unity overpowering the gang's intimidation tactics. Vendors formed barricades with their carts. Teenagers threw sandbags to block the bikers' paths, and the crowd surged forward with a collective determination that could not be shaken. Viper realized they were losing. His crew was scattered, their motorcycles trapped or overturned, their confidence shattered. He revved his engine one last time, his eyes locking onto Marie, who stood on the stage like a general commanding her troops. For a moment, he considered charging at her, but the sight of Jerome stepping forward, his fists clenched and ready, made him think twice. "This isn't over," Viper shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He turned his bike and sped off, his crew following in a ragged retreat. The sound of their engines faded into the night, leaving behind a battered but victorious crowd. Marie lowered the megaphone, her chest heaving as the adrenaline coursed through her veins. Around her, the locals began to cheer, their voices rising in celebration. Jerome joined her on the stage, a rare smile breaking across his face. "They'll be back," Marie said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Jerome nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Let them. They're not ready for what we can do." The streets of New Orleans slowly returned to life in the wake of the Iron Shadow's retreat. The locals, their faces streaked with sweat and determination, began to pick up the pieces of their disrupted celebration. Vendors salvaged what they could from overturned carts, children helped sweep up broken beads, and performers huddled together, trying to bring back the festive spirit that had been so violently interrupted. But there was no denying the damage. Scorched banners hung limply from their posts, tables lay broken, and the smell of burnt gunpowder lingered in the air. Marie stood in the middle of it all, her sequined jacket dulled by ash, surveying the scene with a mix of pride and frustration. They had held their ground, yes, but the victory felt fragile. Jerome approached, his broad shoulders marked with a few scrapes from the confrontation. "You did it," he said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. "We sent them running." Marie nodded, though her expression remained tense. "For now. But they'll be back, and next time, they'll come with more than fireworks and intimidation." Jerome leaned against a lamppost, crossing his arms. "We've handled them twice. What makes you think they're suddenly smarter?" Marie turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Because this wasn't about them being smart. It's about them being desperate. Men like that don't stop until they're either too broken to fight or someone makes them stop for good." Her words hung in the air as the first rays of dawn broke over the city. The locals began to gather in small groups, murmuring about what they should do next. Marie climbed onto the stage, raising her arms to get their attention. "Listen up," she called, her voice hoarse but firm. "We stood together tonight, and we proved that no one messes with New Orleans. But this isn't over. The Iron Shadows will come back, and when they do, we need to be ready." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The older man with the bullhorn raised it high, his voice amplified and steady. "She's right. They think they can scare us, but they don't know who they're dealing with. This is our home, and we'll defend it." Jerome stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the crowd. "We need to organize," he said. "Barricades, communication, supplies. We're not just fighting them off. We're making it clear that they're not welcome here." Marie nodded, her confidence bolstered by the growing resolve of the community. "Let's use what we have. Floats, tables, anything we can find. If they come back, they won't even recognize these streets." As the morning light grew stronger, the transformation began. Vendors and performers worked side by side to fortify the parade route. Old floats were turned into makeshift barricades, their elaborate designs now serving as shields against the iron shadows. Shopkeepers used wooden crates to block alleyways, while teenagers climbed onto rooftops, armed with bags of flour and water balloons, to rain down on any unwelcome visitors. Marie moved through the preparations, offering words of encouragement and advice. She was amazed by the creativity and determination of her neighbors. A group of artists painted bold messages on plywood shields, their brushstrokes defiant. "This is our home," and "Mardi Gras fights back." Jerome led a group of former athletes in setting up a central defense point near the main stage. They carried heavy beams and sandbags like they were back on the field, their camaraderie lifting the spirits of those around them. As the preparations neared completion, Marie took a moment to catch her breath. She stood on the stage, overlooking the transformed streets, and felt a deep sense of pride. They weren't just reacting to the iron shadows, they were reclaiming their city. But the shadow of Viper's promise still loomed. She knew the gang wouldn't sit idly by after 2 defeats. They would regroup, and their next move would be more dangerous than ever. Jerome joined her on the stage, his face serious. "You think they'll come tonight?" Marie sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "If I were them, I'd strike while we're tired. They'll want to catch us off guard." Jerome nodded. "Then we'll make sure they don't. Whatever they throw at us, we'll be ready." As the sun set over the city, the streets of Bourbon Street stood defiant, ready for whatever came next. The floats turned barricades gleamed in the twilight, and the smell of food and music began to return, albeit cautiously. The locals were weary but resolute, their unity stronger than ever. Marie and Jerome stood together, their eyes scanning the horizon for the first sign of trouble. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. They both understood what was at stake. The iron shadows were out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. But this time, they would find themselves up against a community that wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. Night fell over New Orleans, wrapping the city in a blanket of darkness punctuated by the faint glow of Mardi Gras lights. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual revelry subdued by the anticipation of what was to come. Locals stood behind their makeshift barricades, clutching broom handles, metal poles, and anything else they could use to defend their home. The festive atmosphere had been replaced with a grim determination. Marie paced near the main stage, her nerves frayed, but her focus razor sharp. She glanced at Jerome, who was leaning against a stack of crates, his massive arms crossed. His presence was a source of calm for many of the locals, but even he looked tense. "They'll come," Marie said quietly, breaking the silence. Jerome nodded. "They want to make a statement. They'll wait until they think we've let our guard down." Marie looked around at the barricades and the people manning them. Artists, shopkeepers, musicians, and retirees all stood ready. Some wore Mardi Gras masks or beads as a defiant reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Despite their tired faces, their resolve was clear. This was their city, and they weren't about to give it up. In the distance, the low rumble of engines shattered the quiet. The iron shadows were coming. The sound grew louder, closer, as the gang's motorcycles roared down the main road. Viper led the pack, his face twisted with anger and determination. Behind him, the gang carried an arsenal of improvised weapons, chains, bats, and even fireworks. Their headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the defiant barricades ahead. The locals braced themselves as the bikers approached. Marie raised her megaphone and called out, "Hold your ground! Don't let them intimidate you!" Viper brought his motorcycle to a stop just feet from the first barricade. His crew fanned out behind him, their engines rumbling like a chorus of threats. He dismounted, his boots crunching against the pavement as he strode forward. "You think this will stop us?" he sneered, gesturing to the barricades. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you tonight." Marie stepped forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. "This isn't your street, and it's not your fight. Leave now, or you'll regret staying." Viper laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "You don't get it, do you? We're not just a gang. We're a force. You can't win against us." Jerome moved to stand beside Marie, his towering frame casting a long shadow. "We've already beaten you twice. You're the ones who don't get it. This is our home, and we're not going anywhere." Viper's smirk faltered, his confidence shaken by the united front before him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Then let's see how long you can hold out," he snarled. With a signal from Viper, the iron shadow surged forward. The roar of engines and the clash of metal on wood filled the air as the gang attacked the barricades. Fireworks exploded overhead, sending sparks raining down. But the locals didn't falter. They met the assault head-on, using their makeshift weapons to defend their ground. Jerome was at the forefront, intercepting a biker who had managed to breach the first barricade. With a powerful swing of a wooden plank, he knocked the man off his bike and sent him tumbling to the pavement. Around him, other locals fought with equal determination. An artist wielded a paint roller like a sword, fending off a biker who had tried to push past him. A retired teacher used a fire extinguisher to spray a cloud of foam at another, forcing him to retreat. Marie directed the defense from the stage, her voice amplified by the megaphone. "Push them back! Don't let them through!" Viper watched the scene unfold with growing frustration. His gang was faltering again, their confidence eroded by the sheer willpower of the locals. He revved his engine and charged toward the main barricade, determined to break their line himself. But before he could reach it, Jerome stepped in his path. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the chaos around them faded. Viper dismounted, his fist clenched as he squared off against the larger man. "You've got a lot of nerve," Viper growled. Jerome cracked his knuckles, his expression calm. "You're not the first bully I've faced, and you won't be the last." The fight was brief but brutal. Viper lunged, throwing a wild punch, but Jerome sidestepped effortlessly and delivered a blow to his midsection that sent him staggering. Viper recovered quickly, grabbing a chain from his belt and swinging it at Jerome. The chain snapped through the air, but Jerome caught it, pulling it from Viper's grip and tossing it aside. "You're done," Jerome said, his voice steady. Viper glared at him, breathing heavily, but the fight had drained him. He stumbled back, his confidence shattered. Around them, the rest of the gang was retreating, their bikes roaring as they sped away. The locals cheered as the iron shadows fled, their shouts of victory echoing through the night. Marie climbed onto the stage, raising the megaphone once more. "We did it," she shouted, her voice filled with pride. "This is our city, and no one will ever take it from us." The crowd erupted in cheers, their unity stronger than ever. They had faced down the iron shadows and won, not once but 3 times. The streets of New Orleans were theirs, and they had proven that nothing, not even a gang of outlaws, could break their spirit. As the celebration resumed, Marie and Jerome stood side by side, watching the joyful chaos unfold. The floats rolled on, the music swelled, and the smell of food filled the air once again. New Orleans was alive, resilient, and unyielding. "They'll think twice before coming back," Jerome said with a grin. Marie nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "And if they do, we'll be ready." The first rays of sunlight began to pierce the horizon, painting the streets of New Orleans in warm hues of gold and pink. The city that had stood defiant in the face of chaos was alive again, the triumphant energy of its people filling every corner of Bourbon Street. The locals had reclaimed their celebration, and now they were ready to show the world what resilience truly looked like. Marie stood on the main stage, her sequin jacket catching the soft morning light. The exhaustion from the night's battle weighed on her shoulders, but the sight before her erased any lingering fatigue. The parade floats, battered but unbroken, rolled down the streets once more. The musicians, their instruments still smudged with ash, played with renewed vigor, their melodies a testament to the unyielding spirit of the city. Jerome joined her, a satisfied smile on his face as he surveyed the scene. "They didn't just survive," he said, his deep voice filled with pride. "They thrived." Marie nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "That's what New Orleans does. We don't just bounce back, we rise." The crowd was larger than before, word of the locals' victory spreading like wildfire. People from neighboring streets and towns had come to witness the resilience of the city, their cheers blending with the music in a symphony of celebration. Vendors who had lost their stands to the Iron Shadow's attack were back in full force, offering free samples of king cake and beignets to anyone who passed by. Artists set up makeshift booths, painting bold murals that depicted the community's triumph over adversity. As the floats moved forward, the people lining the streets threw beads and coins to the performers, their gestures filled with gratitude and admiration. Children waved brightly colored flags, their laughter a reminder that joy could endure even the darkest of nights. The air was electric with unity, every person in the crowd connected by the shared pride of standing together. Amid the festivities, Marie couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The iron shadows had tried to break them, to tear apart the very fabric of their community. But instead of crumbling, the people of New Orleans had come together with a strength that even she hadn't fully anticipated. She thought of the older man with the bullhorn, of the teenagers who had armed themselves with sandbags, and of Jerome, whose presence had been a cornerstone of their defense. They all showed up, she murmured, half to herself. Jerome turned to her, his brow furrowed. What's that? Marie smiled softly. Everyone. When it mattered most, they showed up. That's what makes this city special. Jerome chuckled, crossing his arms. It's more than special. It's unstoppable. Near the edge of the parade route, the older man with the bullhorn was organizing a final show of solidarity. With the help of a group of volunteers, he arranged a massive banner that stretched across the street. Painted in bold, vibrant colors, it read, "New Orleans stands together." As the floats passed beneath it, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices carrying far into the morning sky. Marie climbed onto the stage's railing, raising her hands to quiet the crowd. The music softened as the people turned their attention to her, their faces filled with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, she spoke into the microphone, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Last night, we showed the world what it means to be from New Orleans," she began. "When the iron shadows came to tear us down, we didn't just fight back. We stood together. We protected each other. And today, we celebrate not just a victory, but the strength of our community." Her words were met with thunderous applause. Jerome joined her on stage, taking the microphone as the cheers began to quiet. "They'll think twice before messing with us again," he said, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. "But even if they come back, they'll find a city that's stronger than ever." The applause swelled again, and the music resumed, louder and more jubilant than before. The final float, adorned with a massive golden fleur-de-lis, made its way down the street, a symbol of hope and resilience that brought tears to many eyes. As the parade reached its conclusion, Marie stepped down from the stage, weaving through the crowd to thank as many people as she could. She hugged the shopkeepers who had defended their stalls, shook hands with the performers who had refused to let the celebration die, and smiled at the children who had watched it all with wide, inspired eyes. Jerome followed her, his quiet strength a comforting presence. "You've done a lot for this city," he said as they walked. Marie shook her head. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. That's the beauty of New Orleans. We rise together." The celebration continued long into the day, the city basking in the glow of its hard-earned victory. The iron shadows were gone, and though there was no guarantee they wouldn't return, the people of New Orleans had proven that no force could break their spirit. The streets were theirs, and they would defend them with everything they had. As the music swelled and the crowd danced in the sunlight, Marie allowed herself a moment to savor the triumph. She looked out over the sea of faces, each one a testament to the power of unity and resilience. "This is home," she said softly, her heart full. Jerome nodded beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And no one's ever going to take it from us." The golden afternoon light bathed the streets of New Orleans, casting long shadows over the remnants of the Mardi Gras parade. Though the floats were now parked and the music had softened to a background hum, the energy of triumph lingered in the air. The people who had come together to defend their city were now gathered in small groups, sharing stories of the night before and laughing as though the threat of the iron shadows had never existed. Marie stood near the main stage, her hands resting on the railing as she watched the community she loved so dearly. Her sequined jacket was smudged with ash and dirt, a testament to the battle they had endured, but she wore it with pride. Around her, children played with leftover beads, vendors reopened their stands, and artists touched up their makeshift barricades, now repurposed into symbols of resilience. Jerome approached, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing one to her. Marie took it with a grateful smile. "Thanks. I think coffee might be the only thing keeping me standing at this point." Jerome chuckled, leaning against the railing beside her. "You've earned it. I don't think anyone else could have pulled this off." Marie shook her head, her gaze sweeping across the bustling streets. "It wasn't me. It was them. Every single person who stood their ground, who showed up when it mattered. That's what saved this parade, not me." Jerome nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but they needed someone to bring them together, someone to remind them what they were fighting for." Marie glanced at him, her smile faint but genuine. "We all fought for the same thing, home." The sound of footsteps drew their attention as the older man with the bullhorn approached, a wide grin on his face. He held up the bullhorn in a gesture of victory. "I've never seen anything like it," he said. "This city's got more fight in it than anywhere else in the world." Marie laughed softly. "We've had plenty of practice." The man nodded, his gaze drifting to the freshly painted banners that hung from the barricades. One read "New Orleans Strong" in bold, vibrant colors, while another proclaimed "Mardi Gras lives on." He gestured toward them. "You know, those banners are going to mean something long after today. People will remember this." Jerome crossed his arms, his smile widening. "They'll remember that no one messes with New Orleans." The man laughed heartily. "Damn right they will." As the day wore on, the barricades were dismantled, the floats were carefully moved back into storage, and the streets began to return to normal. But the spirit of the people remained unshaken. Vendors who had lost goods to the bikers were met with donations from their neighbors. Artists created new murals on the walls of buildings, each one depicting scenes of the community's triumph. Musicians gathered in impromptu bands, filling the air with the lively, unmistakable sound of New Orleans jazz. Marie found herself walking the length of Bourbon Street, stopping every few feet to hug someone or shake a hand. Each interaction reminded her of the strength of the city she called home. She paused near a small group of teenagers who were stacking chairs and tidying up a makeshift defense point. One of them, a boy no older than 16, looked up at her with wide eyes. "You think they'll come back?" he asked hesitantly. Marie crouched down so she was at his level, her expression gentle but firm. "They might," she said honestly. "But if they do, we'll be ready. And now they know just how strong we are." The boy nodded, a flicker of pride lighting up his face. "We showed them." "That we did," Marie said with a smile, standing and ruffling his hair lightly before moving on. As evening fell, the city glowed with a warm, peaceful light. Lanterns were strung across the streets, their soft glow a stark contrast to the harsh headlights of the iron shadows that had haunted the night before. Families gathered on porches, friends shared meals in the open air, and the faint strains of music echoed through the alleys. Marie and Jerome found themselves back at the stage, watching the final rays of sunlight disappear over the horizon. For the first time in what felt like days, Marie allowed herself to truly relax. She leaned back against the railing, closing her eyes and letting the sounds of the city wash over her. "Think they'll stay away for good?" Jerome asked after a long silence. Marie opened her eyes, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe, maybe not, but it doesn't matter, because now they know. This city doesn't break, and neither do its people." Jerome smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's funny. They thought they could destroy this parade, tear it apart. Instead, they made it stronger." Marie laughed softly. "That's New Orleans for you. Take the worst, turn it into something beautiful." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the streets of Bourbon Street filled once more with laughter and light. The city had faced its shadows, and it had emerged stronger than ever. If this story inspired you, remember, strength comes from unity, and there's no challenge too great when people stand together. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of resilience and triumph. Share this with someone who loves tales of courage and community. Let's keep the spirit of New Orleans alive.